So
Okay.
I'm visiting today with Travis Thompson. Travis, how did you become a behavior analyst?
Well, I didn't know what a behavior analyst was, so I didn't really strive to become a behavior analyst. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Minnesota, and I sort of equated psychology with psychoanalysis, and I had absolutely no interest in it. I was torn. Was I going to go to medical school? Was I going to become a botanist, a protozoologist, or what? So I was taking some classes, and I had to fulfill a social science requirement. And I took a class from Kenneth McCorkadale. And little did I know that Kenneth McCorkadale was actually probably the first graduate student who had been greatly influenced by B.F. Skinner when Skinner was at the University of Minnesota back in, I guess it would have been the mid-1930s. And Kenneth McCorkadale, and this is an interesting sort of side story, he taught a course called Advanced General Psychology. And it was really an introduction to behavior analysis. So I took his intro psych course, and all of a sudden I thought, well, psychology isn't psychoanalysis. And actually it's kind of a science, kind of like biology and physics and chemistry. So then I took Kenneth's second course, which was this Advanced General Psychology course, and that was it. I was done. I mean, this was something that made so much sense to me. The fun thing for me was the same quarter, this was on a quarter system at that time, I enrolled in a course in the zoology department taught by a man who taught basically cybernetic theory, which was basic physiological study of behavior, but from a very sort of neurofeedback system perspective. And I loved both of them. They were both absolutely intellectually compelling, you know, died and gone to heaven kind of thing. And so I would talk to Grover Stevens, this zoologist, and then I'd walk across campus and talk to Kenneth McCorkadale and so forth, back and forth, and I loved both of them. I could see no reason why both of them were not reasonable positions to take. And I just sort of incidentally discovered that the notion of advanced general psychology really was from B.F. Skinner, and B.F. Skinner got it from L.J. Henderson, who was a physiologist at Harvard that he had studied with. And Henderson had this idea that instead of studying various kind of sub-disciplines of physiology, you know, plant, animal, respiration, you know, and so forth, he thought there should be some common general set of principles. And he was one of the people who created the notion of general physiology. And Skinner studied with Henderson, was probably most influenced by Henderson of all the people he studied with. And he said, you know, we need that in psychology. We need a general psychology. And so when I took this course from Kenneth McCorkadale, Kenneth was basically articulating this vision of what a behavior analysis approach to psychology would look like. And that was how I got started in it. I just wasn't trying to find anything called behavior analysis.
I think that happened to a lot of us.
Yeah.
We just sort of fell into it. Well, during those days at Minnesota, what was it like, and shortly thereafter, in the early parts of your career, what was it like to be a behavior analyst? Was it kind of you're the odd man out, or was it a lot of people were on board?
Oh, nobody was on board. I mean, among my fellow graduate students, it wasn't yet like it was later, where, you know, there was this cognitive behavior analysis war. But it was kind of the beginnings of that war. So there were people at Minnesota, like Jim Jenkins, very famous speech language guy, and he kind of represented this, what later became the Chomsky intellectual tradition, and Kenneth McCorkadale was this other tradition, and most of the people were drawn to the Chomsky psycholinguistic tradition. And I mean, people were nice to me. I don't mean to say anyone dumped on me, but I was clearly, seen as being over here. And to tell you the truth, I didn't care. It didn't bother me in the least. I didn't, feel a need to have someone, hold my hand and give me hugs and tell me I was swell. I mean, I was there because it was really exciting. And this was a whole new way of looking at the world for me.
I have sometimes thought, particularly up until let's say 1990s, that a huge number of people who became behavior analysts had some common elements of their repertoire to somehow withstand that environment that really didn't reinforce much of that behavior. Some kind of schedule effect from maybe early history or something. I don't know. But,
well,
it's happened to so many people, what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I wouldn't say, I mean, there's some people who probably approach the field in a bit of a doctrinaire way and say, you have to belong to our club or you're not part of the deal. I certainly wasn't like that. I mean, I had a very broad intellectual perspective, but I saw this as a pathway to making sense of the world. It was not so much you either belong to my club or I don't love you. It was that, I think this is a great way to figure out how things work and all kinds of things. And so the fact that people didn't agree with me or, were doing different things, that was cool with me. I didn't care. And when I was finishing up my research training, I did a research project with a guy you may know, David Palermo, who was a developmental psychologist. And he and I got along great. We didn't agree about hardly anything. But, I was doing some experimental work with kids, doing some reinforcement theory-based stuff. And he was critiquing what I did. And I certainly, I always got strokes from him, even though we disagreed. So I think that was an era in which you could disagree without, as I say, being disagreeable. Mm-hmm. And so when I was finishing up, my paper advisor was a guy named Gordon Heisted. And Gordon Heisted, I say paper because I think he was the one who taught me the nuts and bolts of how to do research. What's it like to run a study? And Kenneth gave me the intellectual framework for understanding what I was doing. So I was finishing up and Gordon said, you are going to make a change in the world. Yeah, that's weird. He said, you're going to need your own shop. I didn't even understand what he meant. And he said, well, the next step is you need to work with somebody who is more ambitious and who's more of what he called a blood and guts psychologist. I said, well, okay. Well, what would that be? And he said, well, when I was in graduate school at Chicago with Howard Hunt, who got his training with Skinner in Minnesota, he said, I worked with a fellow graduate student named Joe Brady. And Joe's the kind of person you need to work with. You need to do a postdoc with this guy, Joe Brady. And of course, I had seen his name on publications and stuff. And, when you're that age and, wet behind the ears, it never occurred to me that I would work with this guy, Joe Brady. And so I had finished a bunch of studies. I wrote a letter to Brady. He was at Walter Reed at that time. And I told him I was interested in a postdoctoral fellowship, and I think Gordon probably talked to him on the phone for me. And he invited me to come down. And that same week, I received a copy of a really interesting book in the mail called Tactics of Scientific Research by this guy, Murray Sidman, who I really didn't know much about except he was trained at Columbia. And so I had this black book with the silver letters on it, and I was sitting on the plane flying to Washington reading this book. And I thought, God, this makes an awful lot of sense. And then I realized this guy who wrote this book was at Walter Reed, and I was going to be seeing him in a few hours. And And that was kind of the next step. I think it was really important for young people to understand that there was not a homogeneous field of behavior analysis. You know, in the beginning, as they say, there were among the most important foundational people were trained at Columbia or Harvard. And they made up probably 60% of the first generation behavior analysts. But then there was a bunch of other people who got their degrees at other places. Murray Sidman made a comment one time that among the first generation were people at Indiana, at Minnesota, in Chicago, and a few other places. And so the people who were trained in those other places were a little different. They were not as orthodox in being committed to studying reinforcement schedules and stimulus control procedures. They studied those things, but they were often dabbling in other kind of related fields. In my case, pharmacology. So when I saw Joe's work at Walter Reed, you know, he fit exactly into my way of thinking. You know, Joe's idea was he surrounded himself with the brightest, most talented people he can find who had something to contribute to solving a problem. And he frankly didn't care very much whether they had been trained at Harvard or Illinois or Indiana, as long as they could contribute to the empirical study of this important problem. And so when I went there, I didn't go to Walter Reed, I ended up going to the University of Maryland where he ran the lab too. That was my first, after finishing my PhD, exposure to the kind of behavior analysis that I would spend my life doing.
That leads me to my next question, which is, what would you most like to be remembered for?
Well, that's hard because there are different reasons for feeling good about something. The first work that I did that was of any note was basically the discovery of the behavioral mechanism of drug addiction. Bob Schuster at Maryland and I were doing this study. It was one of the first studies, I guess it was the first study of its kind, showing that monkeys would learn an operant response in order to self-administer an opiate. And up until that time, addiction, from the point of view of the psychiatrist and pharmacologist, addiction was a state that resided within the addicted person. They had an addictive personality, or they had addictive chemical receptors or something. And it wasn't that we disliked that idea, it was that it seemed obvious to me that there was something going on outside the person that that made that proclivity controlling over their life. And so when we first studied the self-administration in monkeys and found that indeed that was a major mechanism by which drugs function as reinforcers in addiction, that was a big deal. Subsequently, Joe Brady convinced the World Health Organization to adopt that as an international requirement for testing the addictive properties of drugs. So that was of some note.
Something to be remembered for.
Yeah. I suppose the second thing, which I happened onto more accidentally, I think it was the spring of 1968, I was asked to consult at a state hospital in Minnesota, in southern Minnesota, called Faribault. And they said, I understand you know about this new thing called behavior modification. And we have all these folks down here with lots of behavior. What they meant is problem behavior.
Right.
And would I come down there and help fix them? You know, I had no idea what I was doing and was pretty shocked and appalled with what I found. And to compress the story, over a period of time, my graduate students and I developed some of the early large-scale behavioral intervention programs for people with severe intellectual disabilities. And the consequence of that work were we had 2 books written about it, a movie, but more importantly, that intervention project was an important part of a federal class action lawsuit that led to the deinstitutionalization of people in Minnesota. So, you know, when I was on the witness stand, Judge Larson, the federal circuit court judge for the Fifth Circuit, at the end of the trial, and I had reported basically what did we show, and we had all these curves showing acquisition and reductions and self-injury and so forth. He said, well, Dr. Thompson, are you saying that regardless of the degree of disability, that this behavioral treatment you use can help everybody? And I said, yes, Your Honor, it can. And that was in his final ruling. When he ruled that the state of Minnesota could no longer claim they couldn't do anything for people with developmental disabilities, and they were already doing the best they could, he said, no, you're not. And so I think that's probably the other major thing that I feel good about. My more recent work, which I also feel very good about, but I have to tell you I feel a little selfish, is working with children with autism and their families. I entered into that work, you know, I've known Ivar Loas since I was a puppy, sort of. And he and I were friends since the 1960s when he was first starting. And it was nothing that happened was kind of a surprise to me. I mean, I sort of thought this was probably what was going to happen. But it's one thing to read it, and it's even one thing to see it in movies, like Ivar's old movie where he shows working with Pamela and Ricky. But it's quite a different thing to have it happen within your own grasp. And to sit in the home of a family where the couple is on the verge of divorce because of their problems with their child, and their child is trying to throw his little brother down the stairs, and he's aggressing against him 100 times a day, literally 100 times a day. And 6 months later, that nonverbal child is talking in sentences, aggression is 0, and after 2 or 3 years, he's in a mainstream classroom functioning at grade level. Now, you can't come away from an experience like that without being profoundly affected. And when I said by being selfish, I feel selfish in that these people allowed me to come into their life and to introduce these ideas in their daily life without really knowing whether they could trust me. I'm sure they thought, well, this guy seems like a nice enough guy, you know, and he talks in big words, and he seems to know some stuff. But the truth of the matter was they really had to kind of take on faith that if they and we worked together for some period of time, their children's life would be better. And I think anyone who's done this kind of work, I know you have in the past, it just, it really changes your life.
And you learn so much about behavior.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. The process.
Yeah, yeah, and I think one of the things that's humbling, I have a grandson with autism, and there was a time back when he was younger, when he was about 4 or 5, that he and his mom and sister and brother lived with us, and when we lived in Kansas, they lived with us for about almost 6 months. And living with a child with autism and seeing how extremely difficult life is for them, how every day-to-day situation is a challenge for them from his point of view, and then also obviously from the parents' point of view who are trying to figure out what in the heck's going on here. This kid is really, really weird. You know, I don't understand. That was very humbling, and any notion that this is easy, just do ABC and everything will be fine, that I was disabused of that very quickly. It's very complicated. You know, when people say, well, you know, all you're doing is rewarding the kids for being good, a little bit more than that.
You've been involved for quite some time, and you've been involved in quite a few areas. How do you think overall behavior analysis has changed over the years, or has it?
Oh yeah, it's changed a lot. In the beginning, if you looked at the early issues of JAB, for example, you got this sense that all of us who were doing that work were in awe of these principles. And we were very excited about applying these principles to horses and chickens and Siamese fighting fish and kids with intellectual disabilities. And we just couldn't get enough of it. We were just trying out to see how all these principles work and kind of push how far would it go. So in the early days, behavior analysis was this very naive, exciting field where we were just trying stuff out. We didn't have really much of an agenda other than, telling each other how exciting it was. And so if you went to the, annual ABBA or EPA or one of those meetings, that was kind of the tenor of the meeting. And the other thing that went with that was that if you look back at the pioneers, the early people, they were very open to drawing on phenomena from related fields. And it was no accident that pharmacology was part of that, because Joe Brady had convinced a number of people, including Fred Skinner, that pharmacology was essentially a field where behavior analysis could be a tool that pharmacologists don't have. And so people were starting to stretch out. Early on, people like Brady and Galambos and Sidman were studying brain stimulation before there was a field called neuroscience. And other people were studying endocrine systems. And I think what's happened over the years that some people in the field of behavior analysis have felt compelled to do more compartmentalizing than is healthy. And so, if you're really a behavior analyst, then you're committed to a radical environmentalist position, and you must be able to show that everything can be treated, well by using external variables. And that's not a scientific approach. A scientific approach is to say, this behavior is a function of what? And can I discover what that is? And then, is there any way I can get a handle on that thing and change it for the benefit of this person? And that's a much more, I think, healthy respect for what a functional analysis means. And I think today we've kind of lost that. I think the other thing that has happened is that the vast success, in particular in the autism field, has driven to the behavior analysis methodologies has become a technology. And that technology is sometimes based on science, but sometimes not. Sometimes it's strictly rule-governed behavior. And so the child has aggression, then, let's see, oh yeah, I use this one for regression. Yeah, it's kind of a rule-governed behavior kind of thing. And that's, I suppose in some respects, that's kind of necessary as part of the maturation of lots of fields, but it's certainly not good for the science of behavior analysis.
So if you had to do it all over again, what would you do differently? Is there anything you wish you had done or hadn't done?
Yeah. Well, I looked over your list of questions before I came, and that was the hardest one. I think I've always been a big believer in having a sense of the rightness of the trajectory of what you're doing. So I've never believed that there is a right way to do anything, hardly. But I do believe very much in a trajectory idea. That what you want to do is keep moving what you're trying to do in this general direction, and you need to tweak it from time to time and tuck it over here and add something over there to keep moving in that direction, and eventually you will find out how this thing works and you'll be able to fix it. I think because of that perspective, I have sometimes doggedly pursued things that I would have been better to let go of them entirely and take a step back and try a totally different approach to them. And early on, I was very convinced that I could do things administratively to change the direction of the field without really grasping the complexity of the variables of which I had no control. So, you know, in the way universities work, there's all kinds of things that as an individual faculty member or as a department chair or as a center director that are way beyond your control. And there's nothing you can really do about it. And so I kept thinking to myself, well, if I just did this one more thing and changed this little thing over here, then we would keep moving that direction. And I think sometimes that's not right. I think earlier on, if I had it to do over again, I would probably try to find a way to involve behavior analysis within academic psychology instead of relinquishing the field to the cognitive psychologists. If you look at the way psychology functions today, particularly like the APA, we have completely lost the whole discipline to people who, some of whom are not scientists at all, and others of them are scientists, and they do study interesting things, but they are very parochial in their perspective. So I think if I had to do over again, I would say, can I find a psychology department, you know, sort of like at Western Michigan or West Virginia or so forth, but probably maybe even a little less inviting. And I would have tried to bring them around in kind of a piecemeal way. So we had behavior analysts who were social psychologists, and we had behavior analysts who were clinical psychologists, and we had behavior analysts who were neuroscientists and so forth. So instead of sacrificing the entire field to people from other disciplines, basically. I think we could have had more impact if I and other people had pursued that strategy. And now, because we didn't do that, we find ourselves very estranged from much of psychology. And there's some very interesting work going on in psychology. You and I may not agree about this, but I think that there's empirical work going on in psychology that we should pay some attention to. And we should study, not necessarily agreeing with the theoretical interpretation, but because the phenomena are quite interesting.
Yes, I do agree with that. Oh. So what areas of the field would you like to see more work in? I think you're kind of touching on that, but can you elaborate on that?
Well, some of us have tried to begin looking at things like private events from an experimental analysis point of view. They're very difficult to study, and you know, Skinner had provided plausible accounts of how this might work, but I think the time is long overdue that we kind of, I don't mean to say we've given up on it exactly, but we haven't really gone after it with a vengeance. And we tend, for example, in our field, to dismiss things, for instance, like psychological tests. Well, what exactly is a psychological test? Well, you present a bunch of stimuli to a person and they respond. And the presumption is, from you and my point of view, the presumption is that there are categories of their responses to these stimuli which comprise macro response classes, dispositional response classes. So rather than saying that's a stupid idea, we should try to figure out, well, how does that work? And how do those response classes that these guys in clinical psychology and so forth study, how do those compare with the response classes that are more familiar to us so we can kind of get a handle on them? I don't think I don't think what they do is necessarily the right way to do it, but I think, like I said before, I think those are kind of interesting things. I was talking to Kurt Salsinger about some of the work he's doing in what he calls tip of the tongue phenomena, which means that, you know, you ask somebody a question and they say, oh, I just can't get it, I can't think of it right now. Well, that's basically what they're doing. It's a form of an autoclitic tact of a state of strengths of a tendency to respond. Mm-hmm. And so I think we haven't done enough careful thinking through of those common everyday things that are part of the human the human story, but we sort of haven't looked at them because, I don't know, somehow they don't fit with, we're not comfortable with them. I think we have abandoned things like the relationship to neuroscience and cognitive science, assuming that all that stuff is nonsense, or somehow we're abandoning our principles if we make reference to neuroreceptor events that are causally related to behavior. We feel we must demonstrate all those events are outside the skin. And if we somehow say, well, I'm going to talk about the discriminative stimuli arising from chemical receptors inside the skin, oh, that's not right. That's not behavior analysis. To me, it's behavior analysis.
It is to me too.
I wrote an article, which I know you've read, functional systems article a few years ago in JAB, and I wrote the article, and then about 2 months later, I got an email from Joe Brady, and he said it's one of the best articles he ever read, and he said, that's what I spent my life trying to do. And I thought to myself, well, that's a pretty good endorsement. This Joe must have felt good that I learned something from him.
Right. What do you see as the future of behavior analysis? Where's it going?
Well, I think one of the things that's going to happen, although right now the applied field is dominated by the economics of reimbursement for autism services, I think that's going to change. And although there are strong political forces against it, I think behavior analysis application is going to find its way into lots of other fields. If I were to put my dollars on one field, it would be aging. There's going to be a growing need for expertise in working with older people with a variety of challenges, and I think we have a lot to offer there. And some of us have already done it, like Lou Bergio has done some wonderful work in that area. But I think that's a big, wide open area. And there are others like that, rehabilitation, which Dennis Russo and others have worked with for years. But I think we've somehow not really dug into it in the same way we have in autism. So that's on the applied side. I think on the basic science side, I'd say we need more people becoming involved in interdisciplinary research. My doctoral students, one of them is at Harvard studying brain imaging and its relation to behavioral reinforcement principles. Another one was hired to set up a brain imaging center in Ohio. Others of them are doing things that are kind of the link between behavioral reinforcement theory-based phenomena and genetics. And I think the way we're going to have impact is not by saying we only study this kind of stuff over here, but we study all kinds of stuff because these principles apply to all of them.
So that leads me to my next question, which is, what message would you like to send to students of the future?
Well, I'd say keep an open mind. For sure, listen to your behavior analysis mentors. They always know a lot of good stuff. But ask yourself, what skills do I need to be able to study phenomenon X? So maybe when I'm a doctoral student, I should be sure to take some courses in neuroscience or genetics or cognitive science, as well as my courses in behavior analysis. When I do a postdoc, maybe I should do a postdoc in a place that teaches some of that stuff. But is also open to allowing me to continue my work in behavior analysis. And I think those opportunities are going to be there. Now, people who are interested in applied work, I think the same is true. Try to keep a flexible approach. You can have more impact by working with people than isolating yourself.
Well said.
So I, for example, there are frustrations about working in a pediatrics clinic because there are all kinds of assumptions about the causes of behavior, and you do this and you don't do that. But the truth of the matter is, if you can very gradually begin educating those people about what we do, but also learning from them about what they do. And I think you can together come up with some strategies for influencing the lives of children, for example, that probably neither of you could do alone.
Good message. I like it.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome. Yeah.
Nice visit. Appreciate it.
Good.